Now, what if we have such low self-worth that because we've just not believed that we are deserving of any type of good treatment, and our scale is so skewed because of our upbringing, what makes us think that we're deserving of any type of good treatment from someone else? A lot of people who are in the cycle of abuse actually don't even deem it abuse because what they grew up in was a lot worse.
Staying silent is enabling. Not jumping in sometimes when you know that there's things that you can do is enabling. There's a bunch of different ways that enablement looks like. How can you identify if you are enabling? And then what can you do to help yourself get out of it? Hey, everybody, it's Bianca.
Welcome back, Evolvers. It's Emilia. In this episode, we are going to get real. We're going to get raw, like we always do, actually. In
What
all
else is
our
new?
episodes. Yes. And with that being said, I invite every single one of you who click on this episode, feel called to it, resonate with it, to really hunker down, because this is going to be a topic that you might not realize that you might be an enabler of, or you have been an enabler of abuse. And I know this certainly was me at one point. I didn't realize that I was enabling abuse. I didn't realize I was a bystander of abuse, which is also enabling abuse, and this is something that because we're not educated on, or we have awareness to, and there's a lot of shame and stigma around it. And then if you're not in that camp, then there's a huge ego camp that we like, no such thing. Again, same thing with trauma and shame. We've done episodes on that where we don't self-identify around these words, because these words, like abuse, for example, feel dirty, right? There's a stigma around them. Mm-hmm. However, when you actually look at a lot of families, a lot of social circles, a lot of social systems that are at play, right? Even your friend group, for example, there's likely some element of abuse that is happening, but because it's been quote unquote normalized within your social group, or because it's been normalized within your family, your culture, etc., right? You don't necessarily identify it as being abuse, right? Like, that's just normal, right? Oh, she just does that. Oh, yeah, no, don't worry about Uncle Joe. Like, he's just like that, right? So it's brushed off, brushed underneath the rug, and that is the issue. So we're not going to brush things underneath the rug. We're not going to pretend like this isn't something that is wildly pervasive in every social group, every social dynamic. We're here to speak the truth and to share how important it is to stop enabling abuse when it is present, how to spot when abuse is present, and what to do about that, because you might be someone clicking in this episode and you might literally be in the cycle of abuse. And if that's the case, and or you're someone that is just curious and listening to this episode, we as a collective, I do believe deeply, share and hold the responsibility to end abuse, to, for lack of better words, raise the red flag when it is present and we do identify it. And have at least a conversation about it. So I want to share a story that came up in one of my calls, obviously keeping personal details confidential. But in this dialogue, I had heard from one of, and this is kind of like a bigger friend group. One of the friends in the friend group was sharing with me vulnerably about how concerned she is for a friend of hers. And, this happens far more than we like to admit it. And I actually coach a lot of different individuals and have exposure into a lot of different friend groups and friend dynamics, which has been really interesting to observe and hear and learn about how friend dynamics in the 30s and in the 40s have kind of played out. Mm-hmm. And this friend in particular that was a client, she was sharing with me how concerned she is about the friend that she has who is in a massive cycle of abuse and has been as a result of her experiences time and time again with a very abusive partnership. And so we were talking about that, and I was really exploring this client's feelings around that and how she felt. And she was kind of caught in between the middle of wanting to be a good friend and sticking around and trying to be supportive to this friend, while also considering and exploring establishing boundaries with this friend, because now this friend's decisions are really starting to impact her life, her family, and really in a negative way. So the consideration as a friend, as a person, someone that you love and care about, if they're in a cycle of abuse, you often find yourself kind of gaslighting yourself, and or do I stick around with this person? Do I establish boundaries or don't I? Because what I found to be at the root of this, if you know someone that's in a cycle of abuse, and I'll define that momentarily, but if they're in a cycle of abuse and you're observing this, you want to be that supportive person because you're fearful of maybe leaving that relationship, temporarily suspending your engagement, setting boundaries. You're fearful that they'll have no one and that they'll just go deeper and deeper into the spiral of abuse. And that's valid and fair. However, by you standing by this person consistently after you've established boundaries, after you've acknowledged what their cycle of abuse is, after you've done the work to let them know that they're in a cycle of abuse, they're enabling this. I don't feel comfortable continuing to enable this just by being here and saying what I'm saying, but you're not taking it into consideration. I no longer can do that because I don't feel as though that's integrity with myself, right? That fear oftentimes holds many people back from doing what is so, so important when it comes to the abuse cycle, which is naming it, calling it out, and then having your own boundaries around how it's going to impact your life. So let's get into the stages and cycle of abuse. And let's start there, because I think it's very important to recognize what is abuse. And this can be anything from mental, emotional, psychological, financial, sexual. There's so many different types of behavior that can fall underneath the category of abuse. But when we look at the cycle, abuse stays in this cycle, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the first stage or cycle of abuse is the abuser creates tension and the survivor stress builds. So for example, right, something happens, right? The abuser, let's say, for example, they go out and let's say, for example, they cheat, right? They cheat on their partner after establishing very specific emotional boundaries within a monogamous relationship, right? That event that the abuser does, that creates tension, obviously, in the survivor of abuse, their world, right? Because now they've gone against whatever those limits, those rules of that engagement, that relationship was, right? Then the step number 2 comes in. After that event and after that tension actually builds, and maybe let's say they call it out, right? Like, I noticed you didn't get home late, and all of a sudden the abuser confesses, right? Like, I was out with XYZ, we ended up kissing, we ended up hooking up, blah, 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 right? The incident, stage number 2, the incident happens. This is where the abuser actually lashes out towards the survivor, the person being abused, through physical, verbal, psychological, or sexual abuse tactics that dominate the survivor. And this is where things really start to get scary, because that lashing out, for example, if the abuser is the one who cheated and then all of a sudden they confess, and then the person who's being abused is like, like, we talked about this. This is not okay. The abuser then lashes out and be like, well, you know what? I did this because you haven't been meeting my needs, right? Like, or you know what? Like, you always go out with your girlfriends and I never feel like I'm getting the whole story, right? Whatever incident occurs, the abuser is lashing out, right? And so ultimately it's a tactic to dominate that survivor, right? So that's where the gaslighting starts. The third cycle of abuse, the third stage, is the reconciliation. So because of that dominant manipulative behavior, where now the survivor takes a subservient role, like, okay, you know what? Like, I didn't mean to get you frustrated. Like, I just know that we talked about not cheating, blah, blah, blah. Like, I still love you. The abuser actually starts to go into this reconciliation phase. They're going to make excuses or attempts to apologize for the incident. Gaslighting is common for the survivor because ultimately they're fearful of any sort of dominant behavior being exposed and shared again. They're fearful of the lash out happening again. And so the survivor just gaslights themselves. Nothing happened, right? Okay, yeah, they cheated, but like it really wasn't that bad. It was just making out. It was just hooking up. It was just blah blah blah, right? Minimizing their experience. Yeah, let's breathe.
I have a client that this is literally happening to. She found her partner cheating, and they had a dialogue about it, and she stayed with him because she is morbidly obese and doesn't believe that anyone else is ever going to love her. So she stayed, and through like the abuse of her family, she just stayed, and they had a child together and whatever. She found him doing it again. And instead of going up to him and confronting him, she's like, "Well, it wasn't that big of a deal. Well, no, that's not really what was happening. What was happening is this, and da 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 da." And it's just like, just completely gaslighting herself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Just the
Yeah, this happens so
this
much. Sorry, babe. I didn't
there's
mean to talk over you.
no, you're fine. You're fine. This happens to so many people. This happens so often. Not just in intimate relationships either. This happens in families. This happens in interpersonal friendships. This happens in work relationships and boss um employee employer relationships. Like, abuse can happen in any dynamic, and if you don't know how to show up, if you don't know if you're the victim, or if you're like a friend or a loved one of the victim, and you feel helpless, it can be so hard to help that person. It can be so hard to know what to do. And I think this is why people end up enabling, because they don't know what to do. I mean, your friend comes up to you and they say that their partner cheated on them, and you tell them all the time, "You know what? I don't like, he or she doesn't seem like a good person. You know, we saw this red flag, we saw this, we saw that." And the person is like, "Well, I'm going to stay anyways." What do you do? What do you do in that
Yeah.
instance?
Yeah.
So I think this is where, the rest of this dialogue is really going to come into play of like, how do you make sure you're not enabling it? How do you make sure that you're showing up in the way that is really going to help this person? And how do you know when to walk away? How do you know when it's the right time to be like, "You know what? I can't for me. I can't do this anymore."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is where, the fourth stage I think is really important of the cycle abuse to happen, because I think as we give all four of these stages, and then what I would love to do is just to reiterate the definition of abuse, because I think that we have a misinterpretation often of what abuse actually is. But the fourth stage, after reconciliation stage, right? The gaslighting happens, and then after that things just go into like a calm phase. So things like kind of seem peaceful, maybe even better than before, because like there was some dialogue about the event actually happening, the incident itself. And even though the dialogue was escalated or gaslighting or whatever, there was some power psychological manipulation going on. At least like there's a part of you that felt as though it got brought up or discussed or talked about or breached upon, whatever, even if there wasn't ownership, accountability, nothing. So it might feel better than before because it was initially addressed, but there was nothing done, no ownership, no accountability, no this, that actually isn't true, correction of the story, whatever. But often this doesn't actually last long because this cycle of abuse starts over again. So the abuser goes and does something, and then they go in and the incident happens. Something happens to where the abuser actually lashes out at the victim. They go back into a reconciliation phase. Gaslighting happens. Nothing really happened. It really wasn't that bad. Or the abuser actually starts to blame the victim consistently for why they did what they did, doesn't take any ownership, gets defensive, and then starts to psychologically deeper manipulate and exert power and control over the victim. And that just builds and that just builds. So this cycle continues again and again and again. Why? Because we don't have a proper definition of abuse. We don't understand what abuse is and what is not. I'm going to literally read for all of us because I think it's an important reminder. Like you said, B, it happens in all different social dynamics. Abuse is the act of improper usage or treatment of a person or thing, often unfairly or improperly to gain benefit over the other. Abuse can come in many forms, such as physical, verbal, maltreatment, injury, assault, violation, rape, injustice practices, crimes, other types of aggression, right? And you can categorize abuse and domestic abuse, physical abuse, domestic violence or abuse, sexual abuse, psychological, emotional abuse, financial, material abuse, discriminatory abuse. Abuse shows up in so many different areas of the world. But what does that come back down to? Improper usage of treatment of a person or thing. Now, what if we have such low self-worth that because we've just not believed that we are deserving of any type of good treatment and our scale is so skewed because of our upbringing, what makes us think that we're deserving of any type of good treatment from someone else? A lot of people who are in the cycle of abuse actually don't even deem it abuse because what they grew up in was a lot worse. And so I know that's
That's
absolutely
so
ridiculous.
true.
It's
It's so
so absurd.
true.
It's absolutely absurd. So to this point, right? I actually, this client, I had let her know, I said, hey, you're actually in a cycle of abuse with this friend because this friend is abusing you. You've asked her not to do X, Y, and Z. You've really acknowledged some of the incidents and how this makes you feel and how this impacts you and your friendship. And she continues to do it. And so by large in part by you kind of staying by her side, although you love her, I do think it might be time for some boundaries to get even stronger and for maybe some benefits of what you're giving to her start to be withheld a little bit. And her fear of gaslighting herself of like, well, what happens if I don't? Then I'm a bad friend. It's like, that's not true, right? So having someone in your corner that can help you acknowledge what is abuse and what is not, and when you might actually be putting yourself in a victim role is super critical. So now let's switch gears. Now that we know the different stages, the cycle of abuse, how do we actually stop enabling abuse? B, what is the first thing that you would share to our listeners? Because I want you and I to give one, and I think we should start there just to start that step.
I think people need to get really clear in understanding the difference between enabling abuse and blaming the victim. You and I were talking about this, and I think this is a good time to dive into this really quick. So before I kind of answer your question, um, how do you know the difference? How do you know the difference between when you're enabling it by not saying anything or by not showing up in a way that feels right for you versus you're blaming this person for what's happening to them?
Hmm. Um, that's a great question. It comes down to, from my perspective, the boundaries. It always comes down to the boundaries. So where do you draw that line between enablement and abuse? Is that your question?
I think a lot of people are afraid of stepping away and not enabling
Hmm.
because they're afraid of then blaming the victim, blaming the person. So like that friend dynamic,
Yep.
it sounds like your client is afraid of the friend being harmed in the situation because of her
Right.
toxic relationship and whatever, and
Yep.
am I blaming her for what's happening to her, and so
Hmm.
on and so forth. It sounds like she's afraid of blaming the friend for what's happening to her, and that's why she's having the narrative of I'm a bad friend.
Mm.
So where do you draw the line between blaming the other person and not enabling them, or and enabling them?
Gotcha. Okay. So the blame, I think there's a big difference. And this is what I talked to the client and multiple clients, right? This is, like I said, I have exposure into many different friend dynamics, group
Yeah.
dynamics, work dynamics, and whatnot. And this literally shows up, in certain work dynamics too with clients. So there's a big difference between holding someone to account versus someone to blame. right?
Mm.
So holding, and this is what I shared. I said, ultimately, your friend said she would do X and said, you know what? I actually do want this life. I want a better life for myself. This isn't okay. The fact that she cheated on me, like, is just not okay. Right. Blah, 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 blah. Right. Like, the fact that that happened is when she goes back and this friend says, you know what? That is abuse for me. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this partner when, or I'm going to do X, Y, or Z, right? That is this person saying that they're going to do something that ends the cycle of abuse. If she doesn't, or he or whomever doesn't do that action, that is, if you just look at it very objectively, they're not holding themselves to account. So, as if you're the friend in this situation, seeing that friend not do what he or she said that they were going to do, right? That is holding them to account. So, if you want to remove yourself or establish harder boundaries because of the implications of them not holding themselves in account to their behavior, there's going to be consequences that they experience. And by default of your friendship and you not having boundaries, those consequences are going to reverberate and ripple out back into your world. So the consequences are going to be experienced by this person, this friend, etc. And so to help hold your friend to account is very
Mm.
different than blaming your friend for enabling the abuse. And so that's the biggest line that I want to just start with.
Yeah.
You have something coming up. Go ahead.
I have a question to clarify. Where do you draw the line in that? So like your client, you told her that the friend is abusing her. I guess where did you what were you looking at that helped you to draw that conclusion? Because someone else might hear that and be like, you're out of your mind. How is she being abused? She's watching her friend do something dumb, but that doesn't have any impact on her. That's a drastic claim. I
Right.
guess
Fair.
I think a lot of people might be listening to this thinking that too, of like, this girl
Yeah.
isn't being abused, nothing bad happened to her. What where did you draw that conclusion from? And like
Yeah.
what were you looking at?
So this is a great question because this friend in particular, she would be the first one that her other friend would call when the consequences of her not holding herself to account of the behaviors of her abuser would impact her. So she would have a consequence, right? Something horrible would happen. This friend that is my client would be the first one to be emotionally connected to the consequences. So she would call that friend up asking for this moral support, asking for emotional um, space to be able to say, like, oh, all these bad things happened to me. Like, I can't believe it. And this friend would pick up. But how long until this friend picks up? So this client of mine had shared back to the person who is being abused in this cycle of like, hey, when you give me a buzz after all these things happen, I don't have time to say on 2 hour phone call like that this isn't a healthy relationship, that there is abuse happening, that you are in this cycle. And then for you to tell me that I know I'm going to do X, Y, and Z next time. And then next time rolls around and that person doesn't do it. And so that's where I drew the line because my client expressed how the cycle of abuse is now impacting the friend.
Her
And by
life.
this friend communicating the consequences of the victim of this cycle of abuse, it doesn't just end with her, right? It's actually impacting every single friendship and relationship that she has. And my client is like, ultimately, I've communicated to you how this is impacting us and how this is impacting our friendship. And I care deeply about you. And you're choosing to not actually do anything. And a lot of people find themselves in this situation where they're so terrified of if something bad would happen to their friend by them not being there and picking up their phone. So they never establish a boundary. However, it's exactly the opposite. And this is where abuse is actually quite paradoxical. If you're someone who is unconsciously enabling your friend in their abuse cycle and whatnot, you might think to yourself that being a good friend is sticking around and picking up their phone call every single time and letting them cry on your shoulder every single time. However, what is quite contradictory in this situation is by you sharing the impact of their decisions and how their decisions impact you and the consequences that they experience ultimately have a ripple effect on you. and that you are responsible, right, for taking care of your needs and making sure that you are mitigating the consequences that are happening in your life. That's where the boundary happens. If you're not saying, hey, honestly, this relationship is starting to take a big turn because you're not holding account to your cycle of abuse, and it's starting to really draw on my resources that I initially felt
Mm.
comfortable engaging with this relationship from the start. And honestly, for me to be concerned and worried, and every single time I talk to you, have it be a drama story and this and that, and you complaining without you doing anything about this abuse, I can't stand by that anymore. I am not going to be a part of this abuse cycle, because technically you're abusing me by saying you're going to do things that prevent harm from happening to you and to our relationship, but you not doing anything. And so at
Mm.
that point, that's where the line in the sand gets drawn, because a victim will continuously take from someone that they can cry on that shoulder without getting help until that shoulder is no longer there. And that's usually, if that shoulder is pulled away, for lack of better words, that is when a victim of abuse actually does get help.
Well said. Okay. So for someone who's listening to this, what are some things that they can do to not enable anymore? Because staying silent is enabling, not jumping in sometimes when you know that there's things that you can do is enabling. There's a bunch of different ways that enablement looks like. How can you identify if you are enabling, and then what can you do to help yourself get out of it?
Okay. So based on that cycle abuse, how do you identify if you're enabling that? You're in those any of those stages, right? And so if you're finding yourself making excuses for the abuser's behaviors or the impact of their behaviors on any level, even if it feels super true to you.
The abuser or the victim?
I'm speaking more so from if you're the victim of a cycle of abuse and you are justifying the abuser's behaviors and or their justification of their behaviors, you know that you're in a cycle of abuse.
Okay. The reason I asked that question was because in the other example that you gave, your client's friend was a victim of abuse in her own cycle, but then she was ended up being unconsciously the abuser in that other one. So you're
In the friendship.
saying,
Yep.
like, whoever you are, if you're on the receiving end of whether it's like a third party or a direct impact, or like just recognizing if that cycle is happening to you.
Yeah,
Okay,
absolutely.
perfect.
And that's the biggest thing. The first step to break the cycle of abuse and or to how to stop enabling abuse for this episode is ultimately it's the first step is acknowledgement. Like everything else,
Mm.
you cannot change or fix or adjust something that you do not acknowledge is in existence. That's why I gave the definition of abuse, so that we could all have a shared definition. So whether you're the victim or you're a bystander of someone being the victim, right? You know what abuse is, you know how it's defined, and now you can acknowledge that abuse is in existence, even if it's at a level 10 or if it's at a level 1. And again, holding in mind that abuse and how we define it is subjective on someone's experience. So if someone has grown up with psychological abuse their entire life and then all of a sudden is in a relationship that's psychologically abusing, they're going to be like, yeah, it's no big deal. I grew up with this, right? Like that's not abuse in my family. It wasn't that bad, right? So their scale is is messed up, for lack of better words, because of the fact that what they grew up with they thought was normal and okay. So they're not going to imagine like, oh, well, them not swearing and slapping me in the face, like that's not a big deal because I used to get beaten by a bat by my dad. It's like, whoa, 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 whoa. Wait a second. Whose scale are you putting the abuse on? Is it yours or is it someone else's, right?
I've had that dialogue so many times with clients. I'm like, your barometer is so off. Like you're used to
Yeah.
like level 25 and
Yeah.
now you're at a 10 and you're not even recognizing it. So yeah,
Right.
that's a real thing. That's a
Yeah.
real thing.
Yep. So acknowledgement is the first step to breaking free. And I'm going to end there because honestly, anyone listening to this episode, acknowledgement seems very, very small and insignificant. However, when you acknowledge that, actually, like the truth gets set free. And the truth is where you can then build more steps to end that cycle of abuse, and you can start to shift into problem solver mode. But you cannot do that if you do not identify and acknowledge the problem that currently is in play. And so, just like that client, I was proud of her. I was like, like, girl, you're in a cycle of abuse. Like, you recognize this,
Mm.
right? And she's like, oh, yeah, I know. I know. That's why I got to set this boundary. And I'm so proud of that client. If you're listening, you know who you are. But with that being said, like, you have to first acknowledge it. And trust me, she didn't want to acknowledge that she was unconsciously enabling abuse through her friendship. She wanted to believe that she was being a supportive friend by picking up that phone call every single time, right? And now she's recognizing the truth of the matter, which is not only, is her friend enabling the cycle of abuse, but she is, by being okay with what is happening and not calling it out and not establishing more rigid boundaries around this, right? By default, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem, right? And so she's recognizing that, and it takes a lot of courage to acknowledge that. So for anyone that's in this, stop enabling abuse, but we do that by getting real and acknowledging it, that it exists in the first place. So if you're
Mm.
struggling with that, that's where it's time to reach out. It is time to reach out to someone who has a different Richter scale than you, that has a different barometer than you, and that can actually help you see things more objectively. So, with that being said, my episode in closing is 379. What is your go to shame response? Likely you're not acknowledging this cycle of abuse because there's shame. There's shame around it. It's riddled with shame, even having the conversation around it. And your go to shame response is withdraw or blame self,
Mm.
right? So listen to that episode, help open up your world around shame, because that, if you have shame around something, you're not gonna be like, oh yeah, no, shame is in, or abuse is in play right now. If you have shame that you've been somewhat a enabler of abuse, it's like, we're not going to talk about it. We're not going to acknowledge it. It's like anyone who's an alcoholic, you have shame around being an alcoholic. And anyone that was a friend enabling that behavior has shame around like egging that person on. But all of a sudden, when they have liver failure and then they all of a sudden have stage 4 liver cancer, right? You have shame around acknowledging that you, by being their drinking buddy in college and whatnot, you enabled that abuse, right? So yeah, that's where I'll end.
We can't save other people. You can do as much as you can, but there is a point where it's like you're hurting yourself by trying to save this other person who's not ready, willing, or able to be helped and to be saved.
Martyrdom. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a losing game. My episode suggestion is 345: How to Not Be Guilt Tripped. We know this is a heavy episode, um, but not enough people talk about these things. And here at Evolve, we really pride ourselves on talking about the things that other people won't talk about, but the things that are impacting everybody. We have all experienced this in one way, shape, or form. And if we're not willing to have the conversation, it'll just keep happening over and over again. So we know this was a heavy episode. Reach out if you need help developing some coping skills of how to navigate stuff like this. And we'll see you all next time. Bye,
Bye,
everybody.
Ren.